So welcome to our strategic discussion on identifying international cannabis opportunities in Europe. I am Sean Hauser and joined here by my colleagues at Vicente, Andrew Livingston and Jason Addlestone. And we are thrilled to be joined today by our colleague, Robert Jappie of Fieldfisher in London, who we've been working with to support a number of our clients who are expanding internationally through, hemp, cannabis research, and in light of scheduling reform and developments in international law and policy, we thought it was a great time to give an update and have a discussion about what the landscape is across the globe and what you all can consider as you look at potential international expansion and opportunities. And Robert, maybe if you want to share a little bit about the firm for our clients who may not know Fieldfisher, we can start there and then get going.
Sure. Thank you very much, Sean, and thank you very much for having me today. I'm a partner at Fieldfisher. We're a European law firm headquartered in London. We have offices across all the major countries in Europe: Germany, Italy, Spain, France, Amsterdam, Paris, Brussels. We've got very strong coverage across the whole of Europe. My area of expertise is cannabis regulation, so medical cannabis, CBD, hemp-derived products, and all of the sort of grey area products that are becoming more popular across Europe. I advise companies on all of the day-to-day regulatory issues that they face, and that has graduated to sort of full regulatory support for the big corporate commercial transactions, the M&A deals and the IPOs. So I'm here today to try and give everybody an overview of what's happening in the UK, but also in some of the major European jurisdictions as well.
Thank you. And as many of you know, Vicente is a law firm specializing in cannabis and psychedelics law in the US, with offices across the country and wonderful strategic alliances with folks like Robert and other countries where there's an emerging industry and ecosystem, and together helping clients navigate the full landscape. And we'll share our contact information after, but this team manages the international law and policy practice, and happy to answer any questions and connect you to our allies and various jurisdictions across the globe. So I wanted to start by talking about scheduling reform in the US, because I know, Robert, I'm sure you're hopefully it's something clients in the UK and EU are looking at. And there's been, I think, some confusion on what is happening and what it could mean for the international market. But as many of you know, the FDA HHS recommended that cannabis marijuana be rescheduled to Schedule 3, which means it finally acknowledges its medical efficacy and lower potential for abuse. We feel confident that the DEA is likely going to agree with that recommendation as they complete their analysis, which they will hear soon, which would then kick off kind of a notice and comment period and implementing that final decision. And is this something that you think folks and your clients and your jurisdiction are aware of? Do you think there's an understanding of what's happening, or is it helpful to kind of walk through some of the process there?
Yeah, so the thing to perhaps in the US you don't realize is that our cannabis markets here are a good 8 to 10 years behind where the US is, right? So we are always watching US developments, because it's like looking into the future for us. And whatever happens in the US has a big knock-on effect here in the UK. So, for example, when New York State went fully legal, suddenly the conversation started over here in London. The mayor of London was saying maybe we should be looking at decriminalization of cannabis and further sort of regulatory reform. So whatever happens in the US has a huge knock-on effect here in Europe. We are always paying attention to what happens in the US, and this is really useful for us here from the UK and Europe, because we've seen a lot of the hot takes on rescheduling, some of them very positive, some of them very negative. We don't have the depth of knowledge to understand how the impact. So I think this is really useful for a UK and European audience.
Great. No, thank you. I think one of the most important considerations is that the state markets will likely remain largely the same. They will still be non-compliant with the Controlled Substances Act and its registration and reporting requirements for Schedule 3, and will remain non-compliant with the FDA, who is unlikely to change its enforcement approach or garner new resources to change how it enforces marijuana products. And we could potentially get something like a new enforcement memo similar to the Cole memo, where the Department of Justice and federal regulators confirm they're going to leave state markets alone as long as they don't trigger certain enforcement priorities. But it is monumental in that it's really incremental progress towards descheduling, which hopefully we'll continue to see legislative frameworks move forward in Congress. One was reintroduced this week. And the acknowledgement of medical efficacy and low potential for abuse has broad impacts. And maybe, Jason, you could share a bit about how this impacts imports, exports, because I think that's somewhere there's a lot of misunderstanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And also want to mention that a few weeks ago, we held another webinar that was focused on the scheduling issue, kind of a more deeper dive into it. And so if anyone would miss that and would like to receive a copy of that video, just email us and we'll be happy to send it out. But yeah, so I think there is some misunderstanding as to what Schedule 3 will actually do and how it'll affect the state markets. I know one of the things we hear a lot is operators asking if a move to Schedule 3 would allow state legal operators to import and export marijuana. And the answer to that, just state legal operators, is no. In order to import and export marijuana, in and out of the US, you do need a DEA registration. And so that's not going to change with Schedule 3. They will still, the single convention, which is an international treaty that the US and most countries around the world are a party to, does require for us, the DEA, to actually register or permit imports and exports. And so that is not going to change for Schedule 3. Whether or not the DEA will open up additional opportunities for registrants, that remains to be seen and is definitely possible in Schedule 3. But it's not going to just open up the market for state legal operators. As far as DEA registrants, it may actually increase their ability to import and export. There are some countries, I know in conversations we've had as far as DEA operators looking to export out of the US, one of the main questions we deal with is a lot of countries would like to have the export permit state medical marijuana is being exported. Because currently the US does not recognize marijuana as having a medical efficacy. If it is moved to Schedule 3 and does have that medical efficacy, then there is a potential that because of that acknowledgement, exported product and also imported product could be labeled as medical and not just have to go through the research prong when exporting and importing. Because right now, if a DEA operator wants to import or export marijuana, they do have to do so under the research prong. And so that is an area that could potentially open up for countries that it may be necessary for an acknowledgement of medical efficacy for them to allow the import or export.
Thank you. And I'm interested in thoughts from all of you on, what this could mean for research, and Robert as well. Like, what are you seeing on the research front over there, and how do you anticipate reforms in the US might impact that?
So the import-export question is important for us here in the UK, because currently in the medical cannabis market here, medical cannabis is a prescription-only medication. It's issued as an unlicensed medication, and all of the medical cannabis being given to patients here in the UK is imported. So the majority of it is coming from Canada, from Portugal. There are now licensed operations to grow and produce medical cannabis in the UK. but they are still quite away from being operational. So we are always looking for experienced cultivators and producers of medical grade cannabis who have their EU GMP certification. And obviously, if the US was to come online and be able to export that product, then they'd probably find an extremely welcoming market here from the UK and other European countries where we have established medical cannabis markets.
Yeah. You know, Sean, I would say another thing to consider when it comes to essentially the global demand for research grade and essentially cannabis for research purposes is how does US rescheduling potentially change the processes in the United States? And Jason and Sean, you could speak to this, or might influence the processes internationally that would increase the number of studies that are going on and the likelihood that those studies go from phase 2 to phase 3, where there's significantly more participants, and as such the need for more research material as part of those studies. If we see a significant boon in more large scale studies on medical cannabis, that sort of demand and as such, the potential revenue for those US or international operators providing that research material would dramatically increase.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Sean.
No, I was gonna turn it over to you, but would just note a couple of things that, one, I think with increased, or the momentum and reform through scheduling reform, and then the congressional reforms that I think will undoubtedly follow, and I think the state reforms that will follow as well, and hopefully if we can get banking and reform, 280E reform will be one of the biggest impacts of getting off Schedule I. Businesses won't be subject to 280E, and we'll have more capital to invest in research. If we have the FDA take an approach like they do with hemp, where they start sending things like warning letters if people make unlawful drug claims, we might see more of an interest in people doing basic safety studies to support, even a structure function type claim, and having more capital to do that. But until this move to Schedule III, the DEA has taken a very outdated and unduly narrow approach to cannabis, including research. And Jason, maybe you can share a little bit about how some of that will still continue given the current federal laws.
Yeah, unfortunately, with the passage of the marijuana research bill this past year, even a move to Schedule III is basically going to keep the restrictive requirements on researching marijuana applicable. The bill specifically is related to marijuana and not the schedule that marijuana is placed on. And the bill basically just applied the same regulations that currently exist for marijuana operators in Schedule I. So in order to really expand the research opportunities available, or that should become available with marijuana in Schedule III, Congress will likely need to amend that bill because the extreme restrictions still exist. But I do think that a move to Schedule III, even if it's not in the immediate term, in the longer term, will help with changing attitudes towards marijuana, will start to make people realize that it's not the same substance as heroin and meth and all these other substances that are on Schedule I and II, especially fentanyl. I mean, having marijuana in the same conversation as fentanyl is just not helpful on the research front, but by removing that from that conversation in that same comparison, I think it just will generally open up the conversation and allow for more research to occur, hopefully allow for Congress to amend some of the research bill, and then will, I think, expand the need for this research. While I'm not sure that the pharmaceutical companies would care that much, because they can do the research if they got a DEA registration, which they would be in a much better place to get one. They could do it in Schedule I just as easily as they can in Schedule III. So I don't think that's going to be as much of an impetus than what Sean was mentioning. You're just going to have the ability for other operators to be able to conduct research that would hopefully be acknowledged by the FDA as being legitimate and a cause to add substances that are acknowledged by the FDA as medical.
Yeah, and I think too, it underscores the need to, in the next steps of getting it, off completely descheduled, and perhaps there'll be, the maintenance of the pathways to develop drugs where, you can make medical claims, and then, more of a supplement, or alcohol type market, and research structure for other product types. And, that's what I think Congress is certainly going to be discussing, in the upcoming sessions. And, obviously those conversations are happening in full force, ongoing with respect to hemp. And let's shift to in talking about opportunities available for U.S. investments, and what are the legalities for folks like most U.S. businesses who are operating illegally under federal law to gain investment from foreign entities? And Robert, interested to hear, where your clients are looking at the U.S., if at all, with respect to potential investments.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously follow the US market. We are aware of the difficulties between state and federal law, but UK investors and European investors very much see the US as a hard market to break into and to understand, because you have so many established operators already. What we want is US capital. There was a sort of big rush of North American capital around the time that Canada went legal and medical cannabis was legalized here in the UK. So we've had quite a lot of Canadian money come into the UK and Europe. We'd love to see some US investments start to move towards the European market as opportunities arise. But again, we realize that the US is the most exciting cannabis market at the moment. So of course, US investors will be focused on opportunities there for the immediate term, I imagine.
And Jason, do you want to discuss a bit about investing in state legal but federally legal markets as far as the legalities and risk go?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the US may be the most exciting country right now as far as that goes, but it's also a risky investment as far as that goes, because right now state legal operators are federally illegal. So investing in those operations is also federally illegal. Granted, there really is no enforcement, but just technically by the letter of the Controlled Substances Act, it is illegal. And so kind of, I think what is maybe unknown or not mainstream is that investing in foreign entities such as UK operators who are operating legally under the UK legal system appears to not be illegal under the Controlled Substances Act. So, and I say appears to be because what I'm about to say is not statutory law, it's judicial law. So it's if you ended up going to court over investing or whatever, which is again pretty unlikely, but a judge can will make this determination. But there is some precedent, which I'll talk about. But basically, the 11th Circuit, which is that covers Atlanta, Georgia, and Florida, has really the leading opinion on whether or not the Controlled Substances Act applies to operations that are exclusively located outside of the US. And basically what that case held, it was about a US citizen who had some meetings within the US and was planning to export cocaine from Colombia to France. So it wasn't going to touch American soil. And what that court found was that if the proposed operation has nothing to do with the United States, will not be imported into the United States, and will not happen on US soil, then unless Congress has specifically stated that this is supposed to apply outside of the US, then the operations that are conducted outside of the US are not subject to the Controlled Substances Act. And so as far as investing goes, if you're looking to invest in federally legal markets outside of the US, such as in the UK, the German market, really any of these markets that are coming online or have been online, then based on this precedent that's also been applied in California, the First Circuit, which is in the kind of Northeast states, based on this, then you shouldn't really have any issue with investing outside of the US as long as the company you're investing in is not planning on illegally importing or for them exporting marijuana into the US. And so, yeah, so it at least based on these court cases, I would say that the UK and just Europe in general is probably more exciting right now to me as a potential investment opportunity because those are legal operations that are trying to figure out their way within a legal framework, whereas US operators are right now just trying to figure out how to survive an illegal framework and are looking for help from things like safe banking to ADE. And so I think there's plenty of opportunities that US investors should look at in the foreign markets. And I think Andrew probably can clarify and get a little bit more into some specifics that should also be considered, though.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. So I would say one of the important things when you're a US investor considering these markets internationally is first and foremost, try to understand whether or not that market is aimed at servicing its domestic demand. So maybe, you know, the growing medical cannabis patients in the country, or whether or not it's aimed at servicing the international demand. Because what we've seen over the last really probably about 5-10 years is of the international federally legal medical cannabis programs that have blossomed, many of them are aimed at treating and really aimed at selling medical cannabis internationally into those markets. You know, with the exception of some of the European markets and a few others, really we have internationally more supply than demand when it comes to medical cannabis, and that creates a dynamic in which your opportunities and your international prices for medical cannabis are going to be dwindling. And what we really need to do is focus on essentially ensuring that patients in their own countries are able to truly access medical cannabis in ways that are easy. The other thing that's important to know is that even though many of these programs most of these programs are federally legal in their home country, they don't often follow the same route and ease as other sorts of medicine. So, you know, even when they are federally legal, they might be a little bit more cumbersome for a physician to recommend, or might require additional authorizations, or might not be covered by the, you know, federal insurance. And, you know, most other countries outside of the United States have, you know, socialized healthcare. And so, you know, if it's expensive because it's not fully covered by the socialized healthcare, or there are other impediments, even if it does allow for, you know, patients in their home country, might be less demand than you think. So that's important to recognize. And then also when, you know, if and when those countries do go adult use, go full legalization, we need to recognize that the United States is somewhat of an outlier when it comes to commercial speech, you know, limits on how much the government can restrict advertising, and the First Amendment when it applies to businesses. Most other countries will treat cannabis as essentially a dangerous drugs advertising. And so, you know, when it comes to things like tobacco, we often see plain packaging regulations. This was pretty clear in Canada when they launched their adult use program, just you know, significantly more rigorous restrictions when it came to advertising and marketing.
No, those are great points, Robert. Interested to hear your responses to some of those points, and given kind of the medical focus of so many of the European markets and the, you know, where you see the challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about this in more detail later, but Germany is the sort of key market in Europe. Germany is the largest and most populous and wealthiest country in Europe. So you've got a population of more than 80 million people. They have the biggest medical cannabis market with more than 300,000 patients enrolled in that. And there's some, you know, fairly serious regulatory reforms coming up, which has got everybody here extremely excited, and not just because of the size of the German market, but because of the influence Germany has on the rest of Europe. If Germany manages to achieve what they want to, the expectation is all other European countries will fall in behind pretty quickly. So that will obviously open up a huge number of opportunities, investment opportunities. And I'm pleased to hear Jason say there may be opportunities for US investors to get involved in the European market without having to worry about federal law.
And that's a great segue to the update on what's happening and some of the key markets. And I know you mentioned Germany really being the leader in reform, but I understand there's also some movement, even if slow, in the UK, Switzerland, and the Czech Republic. And maybe we can start with the UK. You mentioned, of course, it's years behind with a very limited medical program. We can talk. We're gonna move to hemp in a bit, but slow moving on novel foods and hemp as well. But can you give us an update on the latest in the UK, and are things moving in the right direction?
So from a medical cannabis perspective, things are becoming quite exciting here in the UK. Medical cannabis was legalized 5 years ago. It's been really slow going. We've probably got maybe 30,000 patients in the legal market at present, which is disappointing for 5 years. However, the issues that have slowed the progress of medical cannabis here in the UK are now starting to be resolved. And the expectation is we're going to have a huge increase in patient numbers in the next 3 to 4 years. So recent studies show there's about between 1.4 and 1.8 million people in the UK currently self-medicating with cannabis from the illicit market. The expectation is it must be possible to convert 2, 3, 400,000 of that cohort into legal patients in the next few years. And we are seeing a sort of new strategy from the medical cannabis clinics here in terms of, first of all, who they market their services to, but also how they market their services. And we're starting to see some really aggressive and innovative marketing strategies being used by the medical cannabis clinics, and that is really increasing awareness of legal medical cannabis here in the UK. So I think we're sort of hitting an inflection point here in the UK medical cannabis market where we will ultimately have a medical cannabis market that matches Germany. So that's great. Lots of exciting work going on in the medical cannabis sector. CBD and CBD consumer products has been the reverse. We had a real boom period here prior to sort of 2021 where CBD companies were growing really fast. Sales and revenues were doing really well. And you probably maybe saw there was a report around 2021 saying that the UK was effectively the second biggest CBD market after the US in the world, with nearly £700 million being spent on CBD annually. Unfortunately, we had some fairly heavyweight regulatory burdens placed on CBD companies. CBD was classified as a novel food, and therefore, extensive toxicology studies and safety studies had to be carried out in order to achieve compliance. It's been really tough for CBD companies. The cost of engaging in this regulatory regime, the effort and the expense has been really, really hard. And it's a really restrictive regime as well, with the UK food regulators effectively clamping down on new entrants to the market whilst novel food compliance was being achieved. We hope for the long term that novel food compliance will be a platform for the CBD industry to really enter the mainstream here and continue on its growth path. But so far, it's stifled the market, and frustratingly, it does close off the market for new entrants in the immediate term. And I think that's been disappointing for international CBD companies, particularly US companies that would like to be involved in the market here. So yeah, sort of good and bad news from the UK in terms of the two main legal areas.
Yeah, and some similarities really with the US, where they started these processes in 2019 and businesses made a lot of investment, and there's just been a constant moving of the regulatory goalpost. And the industry is really struggling to survive. And I know they recently came out with the standard of 10 milligrams per day per food, which was down from their original assessment of, I believe, 60. In like the US, they're still debating levels of CBD and THC that's safe, and as the years go by. So I think folks over here probably understand the frustration, and I know many of them were hoping there was some promise in the UK. So hopefully they can change course.
It sounds really familiar. I've been using the phrase "moving the goalposts" on a regular basis for the last few months. And it just makes it impossible for businesses to understand or plan. Because the one day a product is fine, the next day guidance is saying it's not, and the retailers are reacting badly to the information coming from the regulators. So yeah, it's a really tough business, and I have to say the UK regulators have not made it easy for businesses that were doing extremely well.
Absolutely. And it seems too, there's been a lot of legitimate good faith investment in safety data and safety studies, and then that goalpost moves too. So it underscores the need to regulate the whole plant.
Sure, and then you have sort of virtually nothing in terms of actual concerns over consumer safety. Lots of people in the UK consuming CBD on a regular basis with for the vast majority positive benefits. Hardly any news of negative impacts or consumer safety concerns, and yet this very heavy regulatory burden has been placed on the industry. It's like using a sledgehammer to crack a walnut, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, maybe on a more promising note, we can move back to Germany for a minute and talk a little bit in more detail about the progress there. Can you give us a little bit of an update as far as how adult use is working its way through the government, and how maybe that's being impacted by broader global affairs? And also, I know there's a growing hemp market there as well.
Yeah, so Germany is really exciting. It's been a bit of a roller coaster for them as well. So if you imagine, Europe is not dissimilar to the US in terms of its federal status. So the European Union has its federal law, and the individual member states have their own domestic laws, and often they come into conflict, much as they do in the US. And so I'll go into a bit of detail about this because it is quite interesting. A couple of years ago, Germany had an election, and the two parties that won the most votes, they went into coalition. And both of those parties campaigned on a manifesto pledge to legalize cannabis, to have a fully legalized and regulated adult use market, just as you see in Canada. So when they were doing their coalition negotiations, how they were going to govern the whole country, legalization of cannabis for adult use purposes was high up on their list of priorities. And so when they formed the government, they also announced this intention to make Germany the first fully legalized and regulated adult use market in Europe. I mean, it was huge news. Like I said, Germany's 80 million people plus, and everybody was losing their minds over the potential opportunity. There was figures coming out of Germany. They were going to need 400 tons of cannabis a year, 500 tons, 600 tons, plus another 100 tons for the tourists, that were going to come to Germany. So, of course, everybody wanted to be involved in the German market. What people didn't realize is that current domestic production capacity in Germany is about 3 tons a year. So if they're going to get up to sort of 400, 500, 600 tons, then obviously there was going to need to be international supply. And I'm sure you guys know well enough, under the UN convention, there is exceptions which allow transit of medical cannabis, but there is no exception in relation to exports and imports in relation to adult use cannabis. So obviously the European Commission was very keen to hear from the Germans how they proposed to satisfy this huge demand that they were now going to need. Germany put forward a proposal saying, yes, we can satisfy the demand internally, we'll ramp up domestic production, we'll grant more licenses, we'll let the existing cultivators have more space and be able to increase capacity. But I mean, it wasn't realistic to move from 3 tons a year to more than 400 tons a year in the sort of 18-month period that they wanted to implement this new program. It just wasn't possible. And effectively, the European Commission said no. People were feeling quite despondent at that point. You know, we thought Germany had really messed up their opportunity. They've managed to resolve the situation by effectively implementing new procedures that will allow them to do as much as they can domestically without upsetting the European Union. So you've got two pillars of regulatory reform that's going to be implemented very quickly. The first pillar relates to home grow. So German citizens will now be allowed to cultivate up to 3 cannabis plants at home. There is also the creation of a regulatory regime around cannabis social clubs. So you can obviously, you know, pull together your allowance and form a club of up to 500 members. And that's actually really, really lucrative business in Germany at the moment. Lots of companies and people wanting to set up cannabis social clubs, and we're expecting that to be a real growth area. The second pillar, which will also be implemented thereafter, is effectively pilot schemes. So cities and towns will be allowed to apply for a license to have a restricted pilot program in their local area. This will see dispensaries being established to sell to registered members, and these pilot programs will last anything between 3 and 5 years. And the expectation is that will form the basis of future legalization and regulation efforts. There has been agreement that cannabis, marijuana, will be descheduled in Germany, and this has been described as a gift to the medical cannabis market. So with descheduling in Germany taking place, it'll actually be easier now to get a prescription. So there is even talk that the 300,000 number of patients in the German medical cannabis market could now increase to 800,000, 1 million, maybe even 2 million people, 2 million medical patients, because it will now be easier for them to access medical cannabis. So it's really an exciting time in Germany. We were obviously disappointed that they didn't manage to sort of go the whole hog, but they're making good progress towards that. And again, you'll start to see other European countries follow in behind and start to implement their own domestic regimes. And again, we hope you'll eventually hit that tipping point that we hope you will arrive at in the US, where, you know, there has to be federal reform, and the European Commission will eventually come around to the idea that there are going to be adult use markets in Europe. It's inevitable. So yeah, that's the current situation in Germany. Everyone's very keen to be involved and introduce their brands. But it won't be the huge demand for international product that was initially hoped, although there certainly will be increased demand in the medical market there.
Thank you. And Andrew, as someone who's analyzed the international and domestic markets for over a decade, what do you think are some of the most important things to consider in looking at the market, the promising market in Germany?
Yeah, as I iterated a little bit earlier, when we're talking about medical programs, it really depends upon ease of access for patients. So that's, the access, what does it take to become a patient? How difficult is that? Once you're a patient, how difficult is it to access that cannabis? Sean and I, have spoken in the past on this, and, I think it really comes to the 3 A's, which is assortment. What type of medical cannabis products are available? Is it just tinctures, or can you also get smokable flower? Can you get edible products? Concentrated products. So assortment, accessibility. That's both, can this be sold at normal pharmacies, or are there, many storefronts you can get it from, or is it only accessible through social clubs or, limited home delivery? And then the last is affordability. So that, in international markets, that often depends upon, is this covered directly by federal public health care, or do you have to pay out of pocket? Is it expensive otherwise? So those 3 A's, assortment, accessibility, and affordability, are really all things to consider when it comes to what that market would look like. And that's why, when I was hearing Robert speak about how decriminalization might actually expand some of that accessibility in Germany, that's a huge win, even if we are seeing delays in the adult use program. In the United States, we have some medical programs that are so large that they almost act as adult use. states like Florida, where we have almost 800,000 medical cannabis patients, and Oklahoma, where over 9%, or at a time, over 9% of the state population were registered as patients. So, if we can get to a point at which, we have, let's say 5% of Germany's population being patients, which has existed in a number of different US states, we'd be dealing with, over 4 million patients. So, even if we get to that 2.5% of the population, which, I think is a mature level in patient population ratios in the US, we'd be dealing with, millions of medical cannabis patients in a country as large as Germany. So that's really kind of interesting to look at when it comes to those sorts of expansions and things to consider. Because as Robert mentioned in the beginning, each country in the European Union is different, just like each state in the United States is different when it comes to what those medical cannabis programs will look like.
Now, those are great points. And I think the social use potential is interesting too, as far as access, depending on what's allowed there.
I would say, hey, United States, we would love cannabis social clubs here too. I mean, I know they've popped off in Spain and some others. Like, if we could come together and have a social club in which we pooled our home cultivation and got to smoke and chill and share cannabis. I mean, cannabis culture has always kind of been, to a certain extent, a sharing culture. Before the pandemic, we were all passing joints. And so, if we can kind of enable the cultural flourish in the US too, it's kind of an interesting thing that almost, Europe's a little ahead of the United States when it comes to that, partially because of restrictions and other matters.
No, great point. And I want to make sure we talk about Switzerland as well. I think it's one that I think is very interesting, and not a lot of folks realize how much progress is being made, and they're leading in some ways in cannabis and psychedelics. And Robert, so they've got a medical program, but there's some pilot programs on the adult use side, is what I understand. Can you give us an update on what's happening in Switzerland?
Yeah, so Switzerland holds a slightly unique status. It is not a member of the European Union, but it is fully engaged in the European Economic Area. So it still has to contend with EU regulations and oversight. But it's a much smaller country than Germany. So if they did want to implement a fully liberalized and legalized adult use market, then they probably would have less pushback from the European Commission. But what they've done is they've gone down the pilot program route that Germany is now looking to implement a Pillar 2. They started this last year, so it started in the city of Basel, I think. They launched the first pilot program there, and as I understand it, there's several other cities now in Switzerland that have also applied to commence their own pilot program. So in fact, I think this year you'll start to see 5, 6, 7, 8 different pilot programs all underway in Switzerland, which will again, very excitingly, form the basis for ultimately a nationwide adult use market there. So they're a little bit ahead of Germany in terms of their implementation of these pilot programs. And again, it's the dispensary model that is similar to what you have in US states and in Canada. Patients and consumers will have to register with the dispensary. And I think they're limited in numbers for the pilot program. Something like 5,000 participants per pilot program. I think that's the number. But yeah, really good progress in Switzerland. And we expect them alongside Germany to be sort of market leaders in this in Europe going forward.
And what about the Czech Republic? Also medical, but with an eye on adult use, correct?
Yeah, so Czech Republic hitched their wagon to Germany. They basically said, right, okay, whatever Germany does, we're going to do as well. So when that was when Germany said we're going to have a fully legal adult use market. So that's always been the Czech Republic plan. Germany's obviously had to row back because of pressure from the European Commission and the European Union. Czech Republic is a much smaller country. I think there's less than 10 million people there in population. So if they were to implement an adult use market, they could probably satisfy their requirements from domestic supply much easier than Germany could anyway. So they would have less issues with that. As far as we're aware, the Czech Republic have said we're going to carry on with our plans. We don't need Germany to lead the way. We understand how to do it ourselves. So the expectation is we will see a fully legalized adult use market there. They've also got some really interesting stuff going on in relation to things like HHC and kratom. Kratom is a really popular product in the Czech Republic. I mean, the figures that they're talking about in terms of sales are substantial. And so as well as sort of considering the adult use market, they are also introducing something called the psychomodulatory substances regime. And this will apply to things like kratom, like HHC, like Delta-8. And so currently there's a lot of business going on in relation to, in the Czech Republic, in relation to kratom and HHC. It's still currently a bit of a gray area, but the noise is coming out of the regulators that they want to formalize and regulate those areas. And that will be through the psychomodulatory substances regime. So again, Czech Republic is a very, very busy jurisdiction. And if, HHC is becoming extremely popular across Europe, if it's not being imported from North America, then it's coming from the Czech Republic, probably.
Wow. No, that was one of my next questions is, are you seeing in the EU the level of proliferation of the high THC hemp-derived market as we are in the US? And in the US, it's, largely state regulated. And, the federal regulators are really leaving it to the states, but there's an increasing demand and growth in that market for high THC hemp.
Yeah, these products are very popular across Europe. We have, here in the UK, we have some specific legislation to deal with analogues and the Psychoactive Substances Act. Basically, it was brought into effect here in the UK in 2015. It's like a catch-all. So it doesn't criminalize possession or use, but it does criminalize production and supply of anything that may cause a psychoactive effect, unless it's exempt. So you have exemptions for things like coffee and all this crazy stuff. So lots and lots of individuals and companies approach me in the UK saying we want to sell HHC and Delta-8. It's not an activity I can support because of the Psychoactive Substances Act. However, there is very little enforcement in relation to these types of business going on here in the UK. So we have lots of very successful e-commerce platforms selling these types of products with very, very little intervention from the authorities or the regulators. So it can be a very, very lucrative business. It just depends on your appetite for risk, what your risk profile is. It's an easier business in other European countries. We have European countries where products like CBD flower are explicitly legal. So this is, again, a very popular product across Europe, and it's an extremely popular product here in the UK. Again, there's a high level of risk attached to it because UK regulations don't distinguish between high THC and low THC flower. It's all cannabis as far as the UK law is concerned. So people selling CBD flower could be at risk of arrest and prosecution as a drug dealer, effectively. However, we've had some recent case law here in the UK, which is really interesting. The courts have confirmed CBD flower is not a narcotic product. So the question is asked then of the authorities, why are you using narcotics legislation to prosecute people in relation who are selling a product that is not a narcotic? So these types of businesses, the risk profile is lowering because obviously there's starting to be less and less the police and the authorities can do about it. It seems, to make sense to me. If these guys are selling the products and making a lot of money, then legalize and regulate and let them do it without fear of intervention from the authorities. So we're on the right track with these types of things. Yeah,
it seems like with the US as well, it's underscores just the next move is to legalize the whole plant and ensure there's regulation for all product types, and drawing these lines is ineffective and in many ways arbitrary. And on that note, one question, and then I'll turn it over to the audience who has some questions. In light of how everything's progressed in some of these medical programs and pilot programs, and with hemp, where do we all see your cannabis policy moving, and what time frame?
So I always tell people here in the UK, we'd probably have an adult use market in the next 10 years. I was probably saying that 10 years ago. So, you know, it's impossible to predict. Things happen here very slowly, and then all of a sudden really quickly. It is a huge frustration to the medical cannabis industry here that there is so little enforcement going on in respect of illicit cannabis businesses. We have recreational cannabis businesses openly touting their services on billboards and posters on the tube. You know, they're giving interviews to the mainstream media about how they're taking, you know, 2 million in revenues a month, and nothing happens to them. The police don't intervene. You know, they 6 months later they give another round of interviews to the mainstream media, and the medical cannabis companies who are trying to be legal and trying to do things the right way. It's incredibly frustrating for them. How do you compete with that? So it's either one of two things. The authorities need to start intervening in these businesses and really support the medical cannabis industry, or you have further legalization and regulation and let these recreational cannabis businesses operate lawfully and pay their taxes and that sort of thing. So my personal view is recreational cannabis and adult use cannabis is inevitable in the UK and Europe. It's getting that time frame right and making sure that you are in the game when the changes really start to happen. The sort of news from Germany is a bit of a double-edged sword for me. With the focus all being on the German market, there was less focus on the UK market. Because everybody wanted to be involved in Germany. Now Germany's had to row back on their plans a little bit. That's better for the UK market. So we have more companies and investors wanting to be involved in the UK medical market. The thing is, if Germany had managed to implement a fully legal adult use market, that would have been really seismic here. You know, you would have seen the dominoes falling and all other countries would have quickly implemented their own programs. So it looks like it's going to take a little bit longer than perhaps we thought a couple of years ago. But again, like I said, it's very much going in the right direction. And again, if you guys manage to, you know, introduce safe banking, if you did have federal reform, it will have a huge knock-on effect here in the UK and Europe, particularly on things like banking, and having institutional investors getting involved in the industry here. So yeah, anything you guys can do to move things along would be very, very much welcome from a UK and a European perspective as well.
We're kind. Any thoughts there from Andrew or Jason, and then I'll open it up to questions.
Yeah, no, I think Europe, especially the European Union right now, is extremely exciting because you have Germany on the heels of Luxembourg and Malta, who have kind of implemented versions of what Germany's doing. I think Malta with their collective social clubs as well, Luxembourg decriminalization. You see Germany kind of taking that along with Switzerland's pilot projects, Czech behind them. I'm curious, one of the things I just saw, especially with the Poland elections, they've been kind of on the conservative side of things as far as cannabis goes. So it'll be very interesting to see if any change occurs there. And I just think the European market is very exciting. But yeah, I think we were all hoping that Germany would be the country to provide the legal rationales for being able to implement a full adult use program in the face of the single convention prohibition against doing such. And now I think we're back to, again, the US being potentially the leader in having to provide that, and hopefully they will at some point. But yeah, I think everyone keeps looking at these large countries in both Europe and with the US as being the countries to do it. And so I agree. I think we are getting close, and it's very exciting to see these incremental moves because they will only just help. And so yeah, just excited to see now the Czech Republic see what they can do and see if they can take it all the way across the goal line there.
I've got a comment that's actually more of a question that I saw in the chat, and I think is really interesting. And I think there's precedent for this in the past, as some of the more conservative movement in the Netherlands, which has historically been very open to kind of cannabis, although not necessarily I was legal, more on kind of a non-enforced side of things with their coffee shops. And we saw some more restrictions, which I think in part were due to the government becoming a more conservative government after the migrant crisis due to the wars in Syria, essentially causing a wave of more conservative governments in areas of Europe. So my question here is, now that we're facing another, a war in Europe and another war in the Middle East, how might a focus on defense, how might a focus on energy crises associated with the with gas from Russia change political climates, and would that be a negative for cannabis? Are there kind of outlying risks in the global political zeitgeist that could create either headwinds or push things forward?
I didn't know I was going to be asked to comment on global geopolitics, but I'm happy to do so. It's
it's an interesting one, yeah.
So look, from an economic perspective, we've had a tough time in Europe, UK especially. So Europe suffers from the double whammy of COVID, the war in Ukraine. The UK has an additional drag on our finances, which is Brexit, and we're still not ready to admit that was really stupid and needs to be reversed. We probably got another 10 years of pretending it was a good idea. So yeah, from an economic perspective, further legalization and regulation just makes absolute sense. From a job creation perspective, from a revenue generation perspective for governments, but we also do have this sort of rise in right-wing political parties and a focus on issues like immigration and that sort of thing. You would think with the sort of liberal non-interventionist attitudes that these right-wing parties have, they probably see legalization or decriminalization of cannabis as something that they could support. They also will see the economic argument. But it's just not a big vote winner among their base to start talking about progressive drug policy regimes. And then we have a situation here in the UK where we're going to have a change of government next year, almost certainly, and it will be the Labour Party that takes over, left wing. The expectation is that they would be more supportive of the legal cannabis sector here in the UK. However, they're trying to win an election. So they are almost going further to the right than the right-wing government. They won't say anything progressively, even remotely progressive. They are talking a tough line on crime and punishment and all that kind of stuff. So it'll be interesting to see in the UK next year whether this change of leadership will have a positive impact or not. We hope that they will get such a big majority in Parliament that they can do whatever the hell they like, and they don't have to worry about all the, right-wing sort of centrist nonsense they've been spouting for the last however long. But yeah, there is no help coming from government for the UK cannabis sector. What that does do is I think I've reached the point now where I'm of the opinion that lobbying efforts of the government in the UK is a waste of time. It's a waste of time and it's a waste of money. And in fact, the way to open up the European markets is through the courts. And that means brave companies taking, test cases onto the courts and forcing governments to change their positions. And that's what happened with the German market. They took a court case all the way to the sort of highest administrative court there. And it was about forcing medical insurance companies to pay for medical cannabis treatments. And that's why Germany has such a big medical cannabis market, because patients are able to claim the cost of their prescriptions through their medical insurance. And that's the way currently in Europe that you bypass the politics of it and you get into the courts with interesting cases with human rights aspects and make change that way.
No, I think that's a great point.
Really interesting. Yeah.
And I think in the US too, so many social movements, we get education and civil rights, through the courts, and we need to be looking at, in addition to legislative reform efforts on the state and federal levels, looking at court cases. And, we've seen the hemp industry recently be successful in a number of court cases in states that sought to ban Delta-8 and other products. So that's an avenue I think that often gets forgotten. We're out of time, and we have a number of great questions, a number on Latin America. So that might be our next webinar. And feel free to, I'll put our contact information here. Contact us, any of us, anytime with questions. We'll be doing more webinars in next year. And please know that Robert's a wonderful resource. His emails here or his services are available independently or through the firm. And really appreciate everyone's time and great questions. And we'll try and respond to some of these questions offline. And thanks so much to the wonderful panel here. It's great.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
Everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.